choice of title for a project is clearly of enormous importance. Wrong title and we're off to a bad start. A successful title, on the other hand, can make the whole project process work and flow very comfortably and very smoothly. So getting the title right is going to be something we need to take time over. It's not something to be rushed. It's a question that will need negotiation, exploration with the student and supervisor. And I think although there's clearly a lot of scope to go in different directions, for me, successful titles in the end do have a number of features, and I've tried to summarise them using the acronym FACE. So the F stands for focus. A project by the time we're getting to A-level standard, the extended project being a level 3 qualification, it's not just like the kind of project you might do at primary school on, say, the Egyptians or the Vikings. It needs to have focus, it needs to have academic depth, it needs to be quite specific. And how that focus comes about varies from project to project and from between different types of project. But it's fair to say that in almost all cases, if a student is writing a dissertation, there should be a central question to provide the focus. If they're doing investigative work, a hypothesis that can be tested. For practical projects, whether performances or art or design projects, a brief where they specify what in concrete practical terms they're hoping to achieve and for what practical purpose. These are the things which can help to focus a project. So let's take an example. Suppose I have a student who's really interested in Formula One. Well, if his project simply consisted in writing about Formula One, the history of the sport, the details about the engines, details about the tracks, the races and so on, it might be quite interesting reading, but it's probably not going to make a very focused and therefore not perhaps a very successful project. So we need to have a question. Well, one question might be, how has Formula One changed over time? That's good because it's more specific already, and we've got some focus there. But it will probably lead to mainly a descriptive piece of writing. And really the most successful projects of all are ones where students get into the argument. They get engaged in a process of argument and evaluation. So we need to have a question really where there's scope for that. One way that could be done is by asking a question such as, should we be doing more to improve driver safety in Formula One? And you can see already that that's a much more specific question. It's going to lead into a process of research, and it's going to lead to argument, to evaluation, to consideration of the weight of evidence, to evaluating the various reforms that have been effected or proposed already. So the first point is to have something that's quite focused. It's worth bearing in mind as well that focus doesn't always come at the start. There's a process often of crystallization as ideas clarify themselves. And sometimes it's not until well into the project that the student really begins to appreciate what it is that they're trying to do. So focus can emerge, and it's something to expect to see happen over a period of time, rather than by worrying about getting the exact nuances right in the very first few days. So that's the F for focus. The A stands for accessibility. For me, one of the golden rules with all project work is that momentum needs to be maintained. The success of successful projects almost always happen because students get momentum and keep it. And so the challenge for a mentor is always to help students to take the next step, help them to keep going forwards, write a little bit more, read a little bit more, do a little bit more each week. Very few successful projects are done in a rush at the end. It's a process, it's a journey, and so we need to be keeping going over the long haul. And for that, accessibility is important. If a student picks a topic which is just beyond them, say the level of research materials that they're trying to read is just too high for the stage of learning that they're at, then they're very quickly going to get demotivated. And so it's always worth asking students to find research sources, try and establish materials and topics which are within their grasp, which are accessible to them. So if after a week or two I'm working with a student and they're really struggling to find anything, or if they found material but it's just too complicated and demanding, then I'm probably going to suggest to them that maybe a move to a slightly more straightforward title would be a good idea. So the A is for accessibility. C is for controversy. As I've already suggested, the best extended projects almost always have a central issue where there's scope for debate, argument, consideration of counter-argument, evaluation of alternative perspectives. Let's go back to the example about Formula One. There's probably no clear-cut answer to the question of whether we've done enough about driver safety. We could probably always do more, but doing more will have an impact on the sport. Is that good for the sport? What makes? What are the criteria here by which we're going to decide? These are really interesting and deep and quite challenging questions. And so engaging in a project where the scope for argument and for counter-argument is really vital. And that's something to be looking out for when students are beginning their project. Have they chosen a title where there's clearly room for consideration of alternative possible answers? And the final point, the E, stands for engagement. I often point out to students that the extended project is the single largest piece of work that they will have done in their lives to date, in all probability. It will take time, and they won't stick at it unless they're personally committed to it. So find something which they really want to do. It's not rocket science. It's an obvious truth of all learning that we tend to learn more and we tend to learn better if we're actually interested in what we're learning about. And EPQ is par excellence the opportunity for students to pursue their interests. And it may be that's a hobby, it may be that it relates to their aspirations for future work or study, it may be a topic that's just caught their imagination in a lesson. It doesn't matter where the interest comes from, but there does need to be personal interest. EPQ is not something that you do just for the sake of picking up another qualification. It's a personal journey, it's a journey which will take time, and there needs to be engagement. And so often we need to allow students scope to change their mind, to decide, this really hasn't turned out to be the thing that's really interesting me. If that's the case, it's probably best to move in a new direction. One final word. I've given some examples based on written projects. There are, of course, practical options that students can explore. If they're doing a practical project, having a really clear practical brief to give focus to the work is important. So suppose we have a student or group of students who want to do some drama. It's probably not a good idea just to take, let's say, the school play and use that as the starting point. Why not? Well, because for the reasons I've given, they need to engage in a personal process of choice about the direction of the project. They need to explore research resources. There needs to be scope for exploration of controversy, alternative different interpretations of ideas, or alternative different practical techniques that they can explore and evaluate. So they need to pick something which will enable them to go on a similar journey of ideas to that which would characterise a written project, but obviously in their case it's going to be explored practically. So an example might be if we take our group of students who want to perform and we ask them to think about their audience and we ask them to think about the issue that they'd like to explore through their performance work. Perhaps they want to do something on cyberbullying. Okay, well that gives us a little bit more focus. What might they explore in that context? Perhaps they could come up with a documentary format or some creative work exploring the impact of cyberbullying on teenagers. And perhaps that could be done as part of a set of lessons that could be then taught as part of a PSHE school programme, for example. There are all sorts of possibilities here. The key thing though is to find a focus, find something which is going to be accessible, Find something which is open-ended, where there's scope for alternative ways of doing it so that they can evaluate the merits of different approaches. And above all, find something that's going to engage them personally. It's their project. It needs to be something which they're going to find personally rewarding and enjoyable if they're going to turn it into a successful project over the time span which the EPQ requires.